For 96 hours, Lieutenant Hattie Robinson was listed as missing in action, her commanding officers believing she had either deserted or been captured by enemy forces. What they discovered when they finally found her would challenge everything they thought they knew about the quiet European nurse who never spoke up in briefings and always stayed in the background. While search teams combed the dangerous mountains looking for her body, Hattie was 3 miles behind enemy lines, delivering babies in a bombed-out village clinic with nothing but her bare hands and medical supplies she'd stolen from her own base. By the time they found her, she had saved 14 lives and changed the course of an entire community's future. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Phoenix as Lieutenant Hattie Robinson made her way to the medical tent, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. At 26, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to being invisible. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, never a strand out of place, and her green eyes held a depth that few people ever bothered to notice. Hattie had been stationed at Phoenix for 7 months, serving as a trauma nurse in one of the most dangerous regions along the Eastern Front. The base sat in a valley surrounded by hostile territory, where the sound of distant artillery was as common as morning coffee. Yet despite the constant threat, Hattie found herself fighting a different kind of battle, one for recognition and respect among her peers. She was the daughter of Irish immigrants who had settled in rural England, raised on stories of her grandmother's work as a midwife during the London Blitz. Her accent carried traces of both countries, a musical lilt that made her voice seem softer than it actually was. This gentleness, combined with her small stature and tendency toward quiet observation, had earned her a reputation as someone who was competent but unremarkable. In the medical tent, Hattie moved between patients with practiced grace. She could start an IV on the most difficult veins, calm panicked soldiers with nothing more than her presence, and work 18-hour shifts without complaint. Her medical knowledge was comprehensive. She'd completed her nursing degree with honors and had additional training in trauma surgery, battlefield medicine, and emergency obstetrics. But none of these qualifications seemed to matter when it came to the assignments that carried real responsibility. Robinson, called Major Patricia Caldwell, the chief medical officer, as she entered the tent carrying a clipboard thick with daily assignments. Caldwell was a stern woman in her 40s, respected for her surgical skills, but known for her rigid adherence to hierarchy and protocol. Robinson, you're on supply inventory today. Make sure we have accurate counts on all surgical materials. Hattie nodded, though something tightened in her chest. Supply inventory, again. While other nurses were assigned to the emergency response team or the mobile medical unit that traveled to outlying villages, she was counting bandages and checking expiration dates on medications. "Major," she said quietly, "I was wondering if I might be considered for the mobile unit rotation. I have experience with emergency obstetrics and trauma care that might be valuable in the field." "Major," she said quietly, "I was wondering if I might be considered for the mobile unit rotation. I have experience with emergency obstetrics and trauma care that might be valuable in the field." Caldwell glanced up from her clipboard, her expression neutral but dismissive. "Robinson, your attention to detail makes you perfect for logistics support. The mobile unit requires nurses who can handle high-pressure situations and make quick decisions. You're more suited to the careful, methodical work." The words stung because they were delivered not with malice, but with the casual certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. Hattie was being categorized, filed away into a neat box labeled reliable but limited. The major's assessment ignored the fact that Hattie had successfully treated multiple trauma cases, that she'd remained calm during rocket attacks when others had panicked, and that she'd spent her off-duty hours studying field medicine techniques that went far beyond her current assignments. As Caldwell moved on to assign the more coveted positions to other nurses, Hattie caught fragments of conversation that had become painfully familiar. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who had arrived 3 months after Hattie, was assigned to the mobile unit. Sergeant Maria Santos, who had impressive credentials but less field experience than Hattie, was selected for the emergency response team. Chen's got the right temperament for field work. Decisive, assertive. Robinson's too hesitant, too gentle for the kind of situations we encounter out there. Hattie continued organizing medical supplies, her movements mechanical as she processed the familiar dismissal. Too gentle, too hesitant. These characteristics, which she considered strengths in patient care, were apparently disqualifications for anything more challenging than inventory management.
The dismissive attitude toward Hattie Robinson wasn't confined to Major Caldwell's assignments. It permeated the entire culture of Forward Operating Base Phoenix. In a military environment where decisive leadership and physical presence often determined respect, Hattie's quiet competence was consistently misinterpreted as passivity or lack of confidence. During morning briefings in the main command tent, she sat in the back rows with other support personnel, while the essential medical staff occupied the front seats. When intelligence officers briefed the assembled personnel about security threats in surrounding villages, Hattie absorbed every detail about population movements, infrastructure damage, and humanitarian needs. But when she occasionally raised her hand to ask clarifying questions about civilian medical requirements, her queries were met with polite but brief responses that suggested such concerns were secondary to the primary mission. "Robinson always worries about the soft stuff," Sergeant Tom Bradley muttered to his companion after one briefing where Hattie had asked about prenatal care availability in displaced populations. "That's not what we're here for. We're here to treat our own people and get home in one piece." The comment reflected a broader institutional mindset that divided medical care into real emergency medicine and auxiliary health services. Trauma surgery was respected. Preventative care was considered less critical. Emergency response under fire was valued. Routine medical maintenance was seen as mundane. This hierarchy of medical importance consistently placed Hattie's areas of expertise and interest at the bottom of the priority list. Dr. Webb, the base surgeon, exemplified this attitude during a staff meeting where medical protocols were being reviewed. "Our primary mission is trauma stabilization and evacuation. Everything else is secondary. We're not running a general practice here. We're running a military medical facility." When Hattie asked about protocols for treating civilian medical emergencies that might arise during mobile unit deployments, Webb's response was dismissive. "Robinson, our resources are limited and our priorities are clear. We treat military personnel first, allies second, and civilians only in extreme circumstances. Your tendency to overcomplicate these situations shows why you're better suited to controlled environments." The controlled environments Webb referenced were the mundane but essential tasks that kept the medical facility running: inventory management, equipment maintenance, supply requisitions, and administrative duties. These responsibilities were crucial to the base's function, but they carried no prestige and offered no opportunities for the kind of challenging medical work that had drawn Hattie to military service in the first place. Her colleagues' attitudes toward her were shaped not just by her assignments, but by her personal characteristics that seemed to contradict military stereotypes. Her voice was soft, requiring people to lean in to hear her clearly. Her tendency to think before speaking was interpreted as hesitation rather than careful consideration. Her questions about civilian populations were seen as distraction from military objectives rather than comprehensive medical thinking. Lieutenant Chen, who had quickly been integrated into the emergency response team despite her later arrival, embodied the qualities that commanders seemed to value. She spoke with authority, made quick decisions, and focused exclusively on military medical objectives. During a casual conversation in the mess hall, Chen's assessment of Hattie was typical of the prevailing opinion. "Hattie's sweet, but she's not cut out for the intense stuff. She gets too emotionally invested in patients, asks too many questions about things that aren't her responsibility. In a crisis situation, you need people who can focus on the immediate objective without getting distracted by peripheral concerns. What Chen and others failed to recognize was that Hattie's emotional investment reflected a comprehensive understanding of medicine that extended beyond immediate trauma response. Her questions about civilian populations weren't distractions. They demonstrated her awareness that military medical missions existed within broader humanitarian contexts. Her careful consideration of options wasn't hesitation, it was thorough clinical thinking. The most frustrating aspect of this dismissive environment was how it created a self-reinforcing cycle. Because Hattie was assigned to background roles, she had fewer opportunities to demonstrate her clinical capabilities under pressure. Because she had fewer high-profile achievements, she continued to be seen as unsuitable for challenging assignments. Her very competence in the mundane tasks became evidence that she belonged in mundane roles. Even her off-duty activities reinforced her colleagues' perception of her limitations. While other medical personnel socialized in groups discussing cases and building professional relationships, Hattie spent her evenings alone, studying maps and medical journals. This solitary behavior was interpreted as social awkwardness rather than dedication to professional development. The irony was that Hattie's supposedly limiting characteristics, her attention to detail, her comprehensive approach to medical situations, her concern for civilian populations, were exactly the qualities that would prove invaluable in the crisis that was approaching. But in the rigid hierarchy of forward operating base Phoenix, those qualities were invisible, dismissed as irrelevant to the serious business of military medicine. As Hattie navigated this environment of casual dismissal and systematic underestimation, she had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would transform her from overlooked support personnel into the kind of military medical hero that legends are built around. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative.
What Major Caldwell and the other medical staff didn't know was that Lieutenant Hattie Robinson had been conducting her own intensive training program for months. Every evening, after completing her official duties, she retreated to her small quarters and transformed into a different person. One driven by an unshakable conviction that she needed to be prepared for situations that her superiors insisted would never be her responsibility. Her quarters told the story of this hidden dedication. Tucked beneath her regulation blankets was a collection of medical textbooks that went far beyond standard military nursing protocols. She'd acquired advanced obstetrics manuals, emergency surgery guides, and pediatric care handbooks through personal purchases and trades with departing medical personnel. These books were filled with her careful notes, diagrams, and practice scenarios that she'd worked through dozens of times. The small desk in her quarters served as mission planning headquarters, though no official mission existed. Spread across its surface each night were detailed topographical maps of the surrounding region, marked with her own annotations. She identified every village within a 20-mile radius, noting population estimates, known medical needs, and accessibility routes. Using intelligence reports and casual conversations with patrol members, she'd built comprehensive profiles of civilian communities that were largely ignored by official military planning. Her language studies had progressed far beyond basic phrases. Through persistent work with base interpreters during their off-duty hours, Hattie had developed conversational fluency in the local dialect. She practiced medical terminology specifically, knowing that being able to communicate directly with patients about symptoms, pain levels, and treatment procedures could mean the difference between successful and failed medical interventions. The most impressive aspect of her preparation was her medical supply accumulation. Using her position in supply management, she had carefully assembled a comprehensive field medical kit that rivaled anything carried by official mobile units. This wasn't theft or misappropriation. It was strategic requisitioning using her detailed knowledge of supply chains and inventory cycles. She knew which supplies were overordered, which medications approached expiration dates, and which equipment sat unused in storage. Her personal medical bag contained surgical instruments, emergency medications, sterile supplies, and specialized obstetrics equipment that most field medics wouldn't even know how to use. She'd included pediatric doses of critical medications, pregnancy supplements, and basic surgical tools that could handle everything from routine deliveries to emergency cesarean sections. Every item had been carefully selected based on her analysis of reported medical needs in surrounding civilian populations. Physical preparation had been equally methodical. While her colleagues saw her gentle demeanor and assumed physical weakness, Hattie had been conditioning herself for the demands of extended field operations. Her daily routine included early morning runs that gradually increased in distance and difficulty. She practiced carrying heavy medical supplies over varied terrain, building the specific strength and endurance needed for independent medical missions. Navigation skills had become another area of intensive self-development. Using topographical maps and compass work, she'd practiced plotting routes between villages, identifying water sources, and calculating travel times under different conditions. She'd studied weather patterns, seasonal variations, and the tactical considerations that could affect medical access to remote areas. Most remarkably, Hattie had been developing surgical skills that went far beyond her official nursing role. Through careful observation during base medical procedures and extensive study of surgical texts, she'd learned techniques that would allow her to perform emergency operations if necessary. She'd practiced suturing on training materials, studied anatomy diagrams until she could identify critical structures blindfolded, and memorized emergency procedures for complications that might arise during childbirth or trauma treatment. Her preparation extended to understanding the broader context of medical missions in conflict zones. She'd studied international humanitarian law, learning about medical neutrality, civilian protection protocols, and the legal frameworks that governed medical care in war-torn areas. This knowledge would prove crucial in navigating the complex ethical and practical challenges of providing unauthorized medical assistance to civilian populations. The psychological preparation was perhaps most important. Through her extensive reading and mental rehearsals, Hattie had prepared herself for the emotional and psychological demands of working alone in dangerous conditions. She'd visualized scenarios involving difficult medical decisions, hostile encounters, and the isolation that would come with operating outside official support structures. Every aspect of this preparation was conducted in complete secrecy. Her colleagues saw her as the quiet nurse who completed her assignments and kept to herself. They had no idea that she was developing capabilities that exceeded those of many officially designated field medical personnel. Her careful, methodical approach to this self-directed training reflected the same characteristics that her superiors mistook for limitation: attention to detail, comprehensive thinking, and deep commitment to medical excellence. The irony was striking. While official military medical training focused on rapid response to acute trauma, Hattie was preparing for the kind of comprehensive medical care that required exactly the qualities her superiors dismissed: patience, thoroughness, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to work independently for extended periods without direct supervision. As she continued this intensive preparation night after night, Hattie couldn't have known that she was building exactly the skill set that would soon be needed for one of the most challenging medical missions in the region's recent history. Her quiet dedication was about to transform from personal initiative into life-saving action.
The exclusion from meaningful medical assignments followed a predictable pattern that became more painful each time it repeated. Every few weeks, Major Caldwell would announce special assignments that represented the kind of challenging, important work that had drawn Hattie to military medical service. And every time, she would watch other nurses receive opportunities that seemed perfectly suited to her carefully developed skills. The first major disappointment came when the base established a weekly mobile clinic program for Allied military outposts in the region. The assignment required nurses who could work independently, handle diverse medical situations, and adapt to primitive conditions. Hattie had been studying the locations for months, knew the terrain and logistical challenges, and had developed medical protocols specifically for the kinds of cases they'd encounter. Santos and Chen will rotate responsibility for the mobile clinic, Major Caldwell announced during a staff meeting. They've demonstrated the decisiveness and adaptability needed for independent operations. When Hattie approached Caldwell privately to express interest, the response was swift and dismissive. "Robinson, those outposts can be unpredictable environments. You're more valuable here maintaining our supply systems and providing consistent support care." The second exclusion stung even more deeply. Intelligence reports indicated that several villages in the region were experiencing medical emergencies related to contaminated water sources. Children were dying from preventable diseases, and pregnant women lacked access to basic prenatal care. A humanitarian mission was being planned to provide emergency medical intervention and establish temporary treatment protocols. This was exactly the kind of mission Hattie had been preparing for. Her obstetrics training, pediatric care knowledge, and language skills made her ideal for addressing the reported medical needs. She'd even prepared detailed supply lists and treatment protocols based on the intelligence reports about specific health challenges in the affected areas. Instead, the assignment went to Lieutenant Morrison, a competent nurse whose experience was limited to trauma care and who spoke no local language. "Morrison has the military bearing needed for this kind of diplomatic mission," Dr. Webb explained when Hattie questioned the decision. "This requires someone who can represent military medicine professionally, not someone who might get too emotionally involved with individual cases." The most crushing exclusion came when a special operations unit requested embedded medical support for a series of raids targeting insurgent medical facilities that were suspected of treating enemy combatants. The mission would require a nurse capable of providing immediate trauma care while gathering intelligence about enemy medical capabilities and resources. Hattie recognized that her supply management experience gave her unique qualifications for assessing medical resources and capabilities. Her knowledge of civilian medical needs would help distinguish between legitimate humanitarian facilities and genuine military targets. Her language skills would be invaluable for gathering intelligence through direct communication with captured medical personnel. The assignment went to Sergeant Davis, whose medical experience was solid, but whose qualifications for intelligence gathering were minimal. "Davis has the right temperament for military operations," Major Caldwell explained. "This mission requires someone who can maintain focus on military objectives without being distracted by humanitarian concerns." Each exclusion followed the same pattern. Hattie would identify a mission that matched her carefully developed capabilities, express interest through proper channels, and receive a response that dismissed her suitability based on characteristics that she considered strengths. Her thoroughness became overthinking. Her comprehensive approach became inability to prioritize. Her concern for civilian populations became distraction from military objectives. The pattern extended beyond major assignments to daily opportunities for professional growth. When visiting specialists came to the base to provide advanced training, other nurses were selected to participate, while Hattie was assigned to manage the logistics of their visits. When complex cases arrived that required specialized knowledge, she was asked to prepare equipment, while others performed the actual medical procedures.
During a particularly challenging case involving a soldier with multiple traumatic injuries, Hattie had identified a potential treatment approach based on her extensive surgical study. Her suggestion was acknowledged politely, but not implemented. The conventional treatment ultimately failed, and the soldier died from complications that her suggested approach might have prevented. No one connected her dismissed recommendation to the tragic outcome. The exclusions were made more painful by the casual way they were discussed by her colleagues. Lucky Robinson doesn't have to deal with the stress of field assignments. Some people just aren't cut out for the pressure. Better to recognize your limitations and stick to what you're good at. What made the pattern particularly frustrating was that Hattie could see the limitations in her colleagues' approaches to the assignments she'd been denied. Santos returned from mobile clinic rotations complaining about communication difficulties that Hattie's language skills could have eliminated. Morrison's humanitarian mission struggled with supply shortages that Hattie's logistics expertise could have prevented. Davis's intelligence-gathering efforts yielded minimal results that might have been enhanced by someone with deeper understanding of medical operations.
The weight of constant exclusion began to take its toll on Hattie Robinson in ways that even her disciplined military training couldn't fully contain. Each morning brought the same routine of professional disappointment wrapped in the familiar patterns of institutional dismissal. She would wake before dawn, prepare for another day of meaningful contributions to military medicine, and find herself relegated to tasks that used perhaps 10% of her actual capabilities. The frustration manifested first in her personal time. The careful study sessions that had once energized her began to feel hollow when she realized that her growing expertise had no outlet. She would spend hours mastering complex medical procedures, learning about emergency interventions that could save lives, only to return to work the next day to count supplies and update inventory logs. The disconnect between her preparation and her reality created a persistent sense of professional suffocation. Sleep became increasingly elusive. Hattie would lie in her narrow military cot, staring at the ceiling while her mind raced through scenarios where her skills could make a difference. She'd replay conversations with Major Caldwell, crafting better arguments for why she deserved more challenging assignments. She'd imagine missions where her comprehensive approach to medical care would prove decisive, where her attention to detail would save lives, where her dedication would finally be recognized. But morning would always bring the same reality. Another day of being overlooked, another opportunity for someone else, another reminder that her value to the military medical system was limited to its most mundane functions. The psychological toll was compounded by the growing awareness that her colleagues' limitations were creating preventable problems. When Santos returned from a mobile clinic rotation reporting communication difficulties with local patients, Hattie bit her tongue rather than mention her own language skills. When Morrison's humanitarian mission struggled with supply shortages because of poor planning, she maintained her professional composure instead of pointing out that her logistics expertise could have prevented the crisis. Most painful was watching medical outcomes that might have been different with her involvement. A young soldier arrived at the base with complications from a gunshot wound that required the kind of detailed surgical knowledge Hattie had been developing through her private study. She prepared the surgical equipment while Dr. Webb and his team worked, knowing that she could have contributed meaningfully to the procedure if anyone had bothered to assess her actual capabilities. The mounting frustration began to affect her interactions with colleagues in subtle ways. Her usual patience with inefficient procedures grew thin. Her willingness to cover for others' mistakes became more grudging. The smile she maintained during dismissive comments required more effort to sustain. She found herself avoiding voluntary social interactions, preferring the solitude of her quarters, where she didn't have to pretend that her professional situation was acceptable. Yet even as frustration built, Hattie's response remained characteristically methodical. Instead of confronting the system directly or allowing her emotions to undermine her professionalism, she channeled her growing anger into more intensive preparation.
If the military wouldn't give her opportunities to prove herself, she would become so thoroughly prepared that when opportunity finally came, her success would be undeniable. Her evening study sessions intensified. She began practicing medical procedures with greater urgency, as if preparing for an exam she knew was coming but couldn't identify. Her physical conditioning increased in intensity. Her map studies became more detailed. Her language practice grew more comprehensive. The frustration that threatened to overwhelm her became fuel for even more dedicated preparation. This response puzzled her colleagues, who interpreted her increased dedication as evidence of her obsessive tendencies rather than recognition of her growing expertise. "Robinson's been spending even more time with those maps lately," she overheard Private Davis mention to Sergeant Williams. "Kinda weird how much she studies stuff that's not her job." The comment crystallized something important for Hattie. Her colleagues saw her preparation as evidence of limitation rather than strength. Her comprehensive approach to learning was viewed as inability to focus rather than professional excellence. The very qualities that made her valuable were being systematically misinterpreted and dismissed. But rather than discouraging her, this new kind of determination sparked a new kind of determination. If the system refused to recognize her capabilities through normal channels, perhaps she needed to create her own opportunities. If her superiors couldn't see past their preconceptions about her limitations, maybe she needed to demonstrate her abilities in ways that made denial impossible. These thoughts remained largely unconscious, forming in the background of her mind as she continued her daily routine of professional excellence in insignificant roles. She didn't yet have a plan for breaking free from the pattern of exclusion, but the psychological foundation for dramatic action was being established one frustrating day at a time. The mounting pressure of unrealized potential was creating conditions that would soon explode into the kind of unauthorized action that would transform not just her own career, but the lives of countless people she had never met but was already preparing to serve. As Hattie's preparation intensified, it began to attract the kind of attention she'd hoped to avoid. Her careful efforts to develop capabilities beyond her assigned role were being noticed, but not in the way she'd intended. Instead of recognition for her dedication, she found herself facing suspicion about her motivations and questions about her focus on duties outside her designated responsibilities. The scrutiny began during a routine supply audit when Sergeant Peterson discovered discrepancies in medical equipment allocation that led back to Hattie's careful accumulation of field supplies. While her requisitions were technically legitimate, the pattern of requests raised questions about why a logistics nurse needed advanced surgical instruments and specialized obstetrics equipment. "Robinson," Major Caldwell called her into the medical officer's quarters after receiving Peterson's report. "I need to understand why you've been requesting equipment that's well outside your area of responsibility. Surgical clamps, emergency cesarean supplies, pediatric medication dosages. These aren't items that a logistics specialist typically needs." Hattie had prepared for this conversation, but found herself caught between honesty and self-preservation. "Ma'am, I believe in being thoroughly prepared for any medical situation that might arise. These supplies could be valuable in emergency situations where standard protocols might not be sufficient." Caldwell's expression hardened. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that concerns me, Robinson. You're not assigned to emergency medical response, you're not trained for surgical procedures, and you're certainly not authorized to make independent decisions about medical resource allocation. This looks like someone who doesn't understand her role or respect the chain of command." The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong. Hattie understood her role perfectly. She also understood its limitations and had been working to transcend them. But explaining this to Caldwell would only reinforce the perception that she was overstepping her boundaries and questioning the wisdom of her superior's assignments. The scrutiny intensified when Dr. Webb noticed her language practice sessions with base interpreters. During a staff meeting, he raised concerns about unauthorized interactions with intelligence assets. Robinson has been spending significant time with our interpreter personnel, asking detailed questions about local customs and medical practices. This kind of independent intelligence gathering raises questions about operational security and appropriate boundaries. Webb's characterization of her language learning as intelligence gathering was particularly frustrating because it transformed her professional development into something potentially subversive. Her efforts to better serve military medical objectives were being reframed as suspicious behavior that might compromise security. Lieutenant Chen, who had become something of an unofficial spokesperson for the medical staff's concerns about Hattie, added her own observations to the growing file of questionable behavior. Robinson asks a lot of questions during briefings about civilian populations and village medical needs. It's like she's more interested in humanitarian work than military medicine. Makes you wonder if she's really committed to our mission here. The suggestion that her comprehensive approach to medical service indicated divided loyalties was particularly painful. Hattie's interest in civilian populations wasn't a distraction from military objectives. It was recognition that military medical missions occurred within broader humanitarian contexts. Her questions about village health needs reflected strategic thinking about how military medical resources could be most effectively deployed. But these explanations remained unspoken because offering them would only provide more evidence of her supposedly inappropriate focus. The trap was perfect. Her dedication to comprehensive medical service was being used as evidence that she wasn't dedicated to military medical service. The scrutiny reached its peak during a formal review session when Major Caldwell presented her concerns to Dr. Webb and Colonel Harrison, the base medical director. Hattie was called in to address what Caldwell termed questions about role focus and operational security. "Lieutenant Robinson," Colonel Harrison began, his tone suggesting a serious disciplinary conversation, "your supervisors have raised concerns about your activities outside your assigned duties. Extensive equipment requisitions, unauthorized training activities, inappropriate interest in intelligence matters. These behaviors suggest someone who either doesn't understand her role or chooses not to respect it." Hattie struggled to find words that would explain her actions without sounding insubordinate. "Sir, I've always completed my assigned duties to the highest standards. My additional activities are intended to make me a more valuable asset to the medical team, not to undermine authority or question assignments." The emergency call came through at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning when Forward Operating Base Phoenix was settling into the quiet rhythm of pre-dawn routine. Hattie was completing night shift inventory duties when the communications tent erupted with urgent radio chatter that sent personnel scrambling across the base. Even under her restricted access protocols, the nature of the crisis quickly became clear through the fragments of conversation she overheard. Intelligence units had identified a remote village called Calarde, approximately 8 miles northeast of the base, where a humanitarian disaster was unfolding. The village had been cut off from supply lines for weeks due to increased insurgent activity in the region, and recent reconnaissance indicated that several pregnant women were experiencing life-threatening complications during childbirth. Without immediate medical intervention, multiple civilian casualties were inevitable. Major Caldwell convened an emergency briefing at 0400 hours to assess response options. Despite her restricted status, Hattie's supply management duties required her attendance to coordinate medical equipment allocation for whatever mission would be authorized. She sat in the back of the briefing tent, listening as intelligence officers laid out the scope of the crisis. "We have confirmed reports of at least 4 women in various stages of complicated labor," Captain Torres from intelligence reported, his voice grim. "The village's medical practitioner died 2 weeks ago from disease, and they have no trained birth attendants. Local communications indicate that 2 women have already been in labor for more than 18 hours without progress." The medical implications were staggering. Prolonged labor without skilled intervention typically resulted in maternal death, infant mortality, or both. The The conditions described by intelligence suggested emergency cesarean sections might be necessary to save lives, procedures that required surgical skills, specialized equipment, and post-operative care capabilities that extended far beyond basic field medicine. Dr. Webb reviewed the tactical situation with growing concern. The village is located in a valley surrounded by hostile territory. Helicopter insertion would be extremely dangerous due to anti-aircraft threats. Ground convoy approach would require a minimum of 6 hours through terrain that's been heavily mined by insurgent forces. Major Caldwell studied the topographical displays showing Calarda's location. Even if we could reach the village safely, we'd need medical personnel capable of performing emergency obstetrics procedures under primitive conditions. The facility reports indicate no electricity, limited water supply, and contaminated medical equipment. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes as various response options were evaluated and dismissed. Helicopter insertion was deemed too dangerous. Ground convoy approach would take too long given the critical timeline. The specialized medical personnel qualified for emergency obstetrics operations were currently deployed on other missions and couldn't be recalled quickly enough to matter. As the meeting concluded, the harsh reality became clear. Forward Operating Base Phoenix had no viable way to reach Calarda in time to save the women and children who were dying there. The combination of tactical obstacles, time constraints, and personnel limitations had created an impossible situation where military medical capabilities simply couldn't address the humanitarian crisis unfolding just 8 miles away. "We'll continue monitoring the situation," Colonel Harrison concluded with obvious frustration, "and provide assistance if circumstances change to allow safe access. But given current conditions, direct intervention isn't feasible." Hattie remained in her seat as the briefing dispersed, her mind racing through the tactical and medical challenges that had defeated official military planning. The village location, the terrain obstacles, the medical requirements, every detail locked into place with information she'd been studying for months. The routes her superiors deemed impassable were paths she'd memorized. The medical procedures they considered beyond their capabilities were skills she'd been practicing in secret. For the first time in her military career, Hattie Robinson found herself facing a situation where her carefully hidden preparation might be the difference between life and death for people she'd never met but was already committed to serving.
As personnel filed out of the emergency briefing, Hattie remained seated, her mind rapidly processing the tactical and medical challenges that had stymied official military planning. The route to Calarda, the medical requirements, the time constraints, every aspect of the crisis aligned precisely with months of preparation that her superiors had dismissed as inappropriate focus. She approached Major Caldwell as the briefing tent emptied. "Ma'am, I'd like to request permission to volunteer for the Calarda medical mission." Caldwell stopped organizing her papers and looked at Hattie with barely concealed irritation. "Robinson, did you not understand the briefing? There is no Calarda mission. The tactical situation makes intervention impossible." "With respect, ma'am, I believe there are options that weren't fully explored. I've studied the terrain extensively and identified potential approach routes that might avoid the main insurgent positions. The medical requirements, while challenging, are within the scope of emergency obstetrics procedures that can be performed with portable equipment." The suggestion drew the attention of Dr. Webb, who had been discussing logistics with Colonel Harrison nearby. "Lieutenant Robinson, you're a logistics specialist with basic nursing training. Emergency cesarean sections aren't procedures you perform with good intentions and portable equipment. They require surgical expertise, sterile operating conditions, and post-operative care capabilities." Hattie felt the familiar frustration of having her capabilities prejudged, but the urgency of the situation drove her to push forward. "Sir, I have extensive training in emergency obstetrics, including surgical procedures. I've studied the specific complications reported from Calarda and prepared protocols for addressing them under field conditions. I also have detailed knowledge of approach routes that could allow safe passage to the village." Colonel Harrison joined the conversation. his expression suggesting this discussion was becoming more irritating than productive. "Lieutenant, your recent performance reviews indicate concerning tendencies toward exceeding your assigned role. This situation doesn't call for improvisation or unauthorized initiative. It calls for professional military medical response, which we've determined isn't currently feasible." The dismissal was swift and comprehensive. Hattie's offer wasn't being rejected based on tactical analysis or medical assessment. It was being rejected because the people making decisions couldn't conceive of her possessing the capabilities she claimed. Her months of preparation, her extensive medical study, her detailed terrain analysis, all of it was invisible to superiors who had already categorized her as fundamentally unsuited for challenging medical missions. "Ma'am, I tried once more. I understand the risks and requirements. I've been preparing for exactly this type of situation. The women in Kalarda are going to die without immediate intervention, and I believe I can reach them and provide the medical care they need." Major Caldwell's patience finally exhausted completely. "Robinson, you've been explicitly instructed to focus on your assigned duties and stop pursuing activities outside your role. This conversation demonstrates that you haven't internalized those instructions. You're dismissed, and I don't want to hear any more unauthorized mission proposals." As Hattie walked away from the group of officers, she heard fragments of their continued discussion that crystallized her frustration. Classic Robinson behavior: sees a complex military medical situation and thinks her supply management experience qualifies her to solve it. This is exactly why we had to implement those performance restrictions. The irony was devastating. The crisis in Kalarda required exactly the combination of skills Hattie had been developing: emergency obstetrics expertise, detailed terrain knowledge, ability to work independently under primitive conditions, and the kind of comprehensive medical thinking that her superiors consistently dismissed as unfocused. But rather than recognizing these qualifications, the military medical hierarchy was allowing their preconceptions about her limitations to override life-and-death decision-making. 4 women and their unborn children would die not because rescue was impossible, but because the person capable of attempting rescue wasn't considered worthy of the opportunity. As she returned to her quarters, she realized that the formal restrictions placed on her activities had inadvertently created perfect conditions for unauthorized action. Her supervisors were so confident in their assessment of her limitations that they wouldn't consider the possibility of her attempting what they deemed impossible.
Alone in her quarters after the dismissed briefing, Hattie Robinson faced the most significant decision of her military career. The official position was clear: no mission to Kalarda would be authorized due to tactical impossibility and personnel limitations. 4 women and their unborn children would die while the military medical establishment waited for circumstances that would never change. She sat on her narrow cot, staring at the wall where her confiscated maps used to hang. But the details didn't need visual reference. Every route to Kalarda was memorized, every terrain obstacle analyzed, every tactical consideration evaluated during months of preparation that had been dismissed as inappropriate focus. The path to the village was challenging, but achievable for someone with the right skills and determination. The medical requirements were equally clear in her mind. The obstetrics complications described in intelligence reports matched scenarios she'd studied extensively: emergency cesarean procedures, post-surgical stabilization, neonatal resuscitation. She had prepared for exactly these situations through reading, practice, and mental rehearsal that her superiors had forbidden as exceeding her role. Time was the critical factor. Each hour of delay increased the likelihood of maternal and infant mortality. The women who had been in labor for 18 hours were approaching the point where emergency intervention would become futile rather than life-saving. By morning, the medical crisis would likely resolve itself through death rather than successful delivery. The choice before her was stark: follow military protocol and accept that preventable deaths would occur,
or act independently to save lives using skills that officially didn't exist because they'd been acquired outside authorized channels. The decision required her to weigh military discipline against medical ethics, institutional loyalty against humanitarian obligation. She thought about the restrictions that had been imposed on her activities, the surveillance that monitored her behavior, and the explicit orders to limit herself to assigned duties. Breaking those restrictions would constitute direct insubordination, possible court-martial charges, and the end of her military medical career. The personal cost of unauthorized action would be substantial and irreversible. But she also thought about her grandmother's stories of delivering babies during London bombing raids, working by candlelight while buildings collapsed around her, because saving lives was more important than personal safety. Medical training carried ethical obligations that sometimes transcended institutional rules. The Hippocratic principle of do no harm included the corollary obligation to prevent harm when possible. The tactical analysis was encouraging. Her restricted duty schedule meant that her absence wouldn't be noticed until the morning shift change, giving her approximately 6 hours of operational window. The route she'd identified avoided main patrol areas and insurgent positions, following terrain features that provided natural concealment. Her accumulated medical supplies, while confiscated officially, remained accessible through her knowledge of storage protocols and security procedures. Most importantly, she possessed the unique combination of skills, knowledge, and preparation that the crisis required. No other personnel at Forward Operating Base Phoenix had her obstetrics expertise, terrain familiarity, and willingness to operate independently under dangerous conditions. If she didn't act, no one would. The decision crystallized as she considered the alternative to action. Tomorrow morning, intelligence reports would confirm the deaths of women and children who could have been saved. She would return to her restricted duties knowing that her preparation, all those months of study, training, and careful planning, had been meaningless because she lacked the courage to use it when lives depended on her skills. Hattie Robinson stood up and began gathering the equipment she would need for an unauthorized medical mission that would either save lives and prove her worth or end her military career and possibly her life. The choice between safe compliance and dangerous service had become no choice at all. The women in Day needed someone willing to risk everything to reach them. For the first time in her military career, that someone would be her.
At 0130 hours, while Forward Operating Base Phoenix settled into its deepest sleep cycle, Lieutenant Hattie Robinson began the most dangerous medical mission of her career. She moved through the base with the quiet confidence of someone whose every action had been rehearsed dozens of times, her footsteps silent on familiar pathways that she'd memorized during months of restricted duty. Her first stop was the medical supply depot, where her intimate knowledge of inventory systems and security protocols allowed her to retrieve the confiscated equipment she'd need for emergency obstetrics procedures. Surgical instruments, sterile supplies, emergency medications, and portable monitoring equipment disappeared into her carefully organized medical pack. Every item had been selected based on specific analysis of the complications reported from Day. The route out of the base followed maintenance corridors and blind spots that her supply management duties had revealed over months of careful observation. Security protocols designed to prevent infiltration were less effective at preventing exfiltration, especially by someone who understood the systems from the inside. She reached the perimeter fence at 0200 hours, exactly on the schedule she'd planned. The 8-mile journey to Day tested every aspect of her physical and mental preparation. The terrain was treacherous even in daylight. Navigating it in darkness while carrying 40 pounds of medical equipment required the kind of conditioning and route familiarity that her superiors had dismissed as unnecessary for her role. But the path she'd chosen avoided main patrol areas and known insurgent positions, following ridgelines and valley floors that provided natural concealment. Her language skills proved crucial when she encountered a civilian shepherd 3 miles from the village.
Instead of a hostile confrontation that might have ended her mission, her ability to communicate in the local dialect allowed her to explain her medical purpose and receive critical intelligence about recent insurgent movement patterns. The shepherd, whose wife had died in childbirth the previous year, provided guide services for the final approach to Kalar Day. The village was worse than intelligence reports had indicated. What had been described as primitive conditions was actually a humanitarian catastrophe. Buildings showed fresh damage from recent fighting, the water supply was contaminated, and the population was surviving on inadequate food stores. The 4 women in labor were being cared for in a single room of the village's bombed-out clinic, attended by elderly women whose traditional knowledge was insufficient for the complications they faced. Hattie's arrival at 0600 hours created immediate confusion that her language abilities helped resolve quickly. The village elders were initially suspicious of a foreign military presence, but her ability to explain her medical training and purpose in their own language, combined with the obviously critical situation, gained their cautious cooperation. The village's surviving religious leader, who served as unofficial medical coordinator, briefed her on each case with desperate hope. The medical challenges were exactly what she'd prepared for, but more urgent than she had anticipated. 2 women required immediate cesarean sections to save both maternal and infant lives. A third was experiencing hemorrhaging that needed surgical intervention. The 4th had a breech presentation that required manual repositioning skills that her obstetrics training had covered extensively. Working by candlelight and portable battery-powered equipment, Hattie began the most demanding medical procedures of her career. Her months of study transformed into life-saving action as she performed emergency surgery under conditions that would challenge experienced hospital physicians. The comprehensive preparation that her superiors had dismissed as inappropriate focus became the difference between life and death for women and children whose names she didn't know, but whose lives now depended entirely on her skills.
For 96 hours, Lieutenant Hattie Robinson worked miracles in a bombed-out clinic while Forward Operating Base Phoenix conducted increasingly frantic search operations for their missing nurse. What they found when they finally located her would transform not just military medical protocols, but the entire understanding of what was possible when preparation met opportunity and courage. By the end of her first day in Kalar Day, Hattie had successfully performed 3 emergency cesarean sections and assisted with 2 complicated vaginal deliveries. All 5 women survived procedures that would have been challenging even in a fully equipped hospital. More remarkably, all 7 babies, including a set of twins from one of the cesarean cases, were healthy and thriving under her post-operative care protocols. But her work didn't stop with the initial crisis. As word spread through the refugee population, women from surrounding villages began arriving with pregnancy complications that had been building for weeks. Hattie found herself running a field obstetrics clinic that served a population far beyond Kalar Day's boundaries. Her supplies, carefully calculated for the reported 4 cases, had to be stretched to accommodate 14 deliveries over 4 days. The tactical situation deteriorated on her second day when insurgent forces began probing village defenses, apparently drawn by reports of foreign military presence. But instead of forcing her evacuation, the threats reinforced her determination to complete her mission. She moved her patients to the clinic's basement, continuing medical procedures by flashlight while artillery exchanges echoed overhead. Her language skills proved as valuable as her medical expertise. She was able to coordinate with village defenders about security arrangements, communicate directly with patients about their conditions, and organize the community support network that kept her makeshift clinic functioning. The comprehensive preparation that had been dismissed as exceeding her role became the foundation for saving lives under impossible conditions.
The search and rescue operation that located her after 96 hours found a scene that defied every assumption about military medical capabilities. Hattie was discovered delivering her 14th baby, a healthy girl born to a teenager who had walked 8 miles through hostile territory to reach the clinic. Around her, previous patients were recovering according to post-operative protocols that rivaled anything available at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Major Caldwell, who led the search team, found herself speechless as she surveyed the medical facility that Hattie had created from nothing. 14 successful deliveries, 0 maternal mortality, comprehensive post-operative care, and detailed medical documentation that would become a case study in emergency obstetrics procedures. The quiet nurse who had been told to focus on counting supplies became the military medical officer whose unauthorized actions saved 14 lives and changed how the military approached emergency humanitarian medical intervention. Her story proved that preparation, determination, and courage could transform limitations into life-saving action when someone was willing to risk everything for people who needed help. Sometimes being underestimated became the perfect disguise for accomplishing the impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.